أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل في القرآن المجيد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون صلوا على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For the last few nights we have been discussing some of the attributes which it is important for a believer to understand and to develop, and the importance of looking at these attributes as a whole as an important part of maintaining and deepening our faith and our iman. I would like to continue that discussion yesterday and also in our time together today. I will be talking a little bit about the religion of Islam in comparison with Christianity and Judaism. Before I do so, I want to make 2 points. Number one, we might think that if this is a majlis which is an Islamic gathering and which is dedicated to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, then what is the relevance or what is the importance of mentioning or talking about any other religion? Now, it's not just because we live in a Christian or a Jewish or a Judeo-Christian country that this becomes important. Even if we lived in an atheist country, or a Buddhist country, or a Hindu country, it still would have been important for us in our religious gatherings to have an understanding of the Jewish and the Christian traditions and religion. Because our belief as Muslims is that the primary job of the Prophet was to correct the changes that had come into the religion that was preached and that was taught by the prophets who are known to the Jews and to the Christians and who are mentioned in the scripture of the Jews and the Christians. To correct those scriptures from the changes that had been made and to restore the honor of those prophets whose message had been corrupted. And so, if a Christian or a Jew reads the Quran, then they will immediately find themselves at home in terms of understanding who the main characters in the Quranic stories are. But they will not necessarily find themselves at home in the way that those same personalities are described. Because even though some of the same stories are referenced, the Quran describes the lives of those prophets not in terms of historical details. Nobody has used the Quran as a book of history or archaeology as people have tried to do with the Bible. It doesn't work with the Bible because some of the changes have made those stories be clearly inaccurate from a historical perspective. But because the framing of the stories in the Bible or in the Old Testament is historical, for many generations and in earlier centuries, scholars thought that they could understand Egyptian history, for example, by looking at the story in the Bible of Musa and Fir'aun. They thought they could understand the history of Palestine by looking at what the Bible says about the lifetime of Prophet Ibrahim or the lifetime of Prophet Dawood or Prophet Sulyman or other stories in the Bible. The framing of the stories in the Bible is historical, even if the details have been changed and are not always accurate. But the Quran doesn't do that. It frames the lifetime of all of the prophets in terms of values and in terms of a mission. And so there is a consistent thread running through all of the stories of the different prophets in different times, in different communities. Some who came to large civilizations and big cities, and some who came to small tribes and small communities. And the honor and the sincerity and the devotion of those prophets, it is mentioned in the Quran. So in one sense, when a Jewish reader or a Christian reader looks at the Quran, they will find the story to be immediately familiar. I know this person. I know the name of Musa alayhi salam. I know the name of Nuh alayhi salam. I know the names of the other prophets. But then these details, this is not exactly the way that it has been presented in that scripture. And I can add to that, that if a Muslim looks at the Quranic corrections and completions without being familiar with what it was that the Jews and the Christians used to say, then they won't be able to make sense of all of the Quranic stories and why it is that the Quran emphasizes certain points. The Quran is engaging in a conversation and trying to bring those previous religious communities to the truth. So yes, because we live in a Christian country, we should know the religious landscape of the society that we live in. But even if we didn't live in a Christian country, it was still important for us to properly understand what the Quran and what the Prophet of Islam were trying to do, to know whom they were addressing and what were the mistakes that they were correcting. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad. And in fact, the true message of Ahlul Bayt was to preserve that correction and to ensure that Muslims didn't go and make the same mistakes that the Jews and the Christians made. If you look at the other schools of thought that exist within Islam, the source of their mistakes is that they did exactly what previous religious communities did. Because they didn't do those mistakes for some unusual circumstance that came in their own history. They made those mistakes because of the weaknesses of human nature. And so many Muslims did the same thing. We see other schools of thought, they misunderstood Tawheed. And there are some schools of thought within Islam that also misunderstood Tawheed. We see that the Jews and the Christians, they attributed stories that bring down the honor of their prophets. And we see that other Muslims, they also attributed similar stories to those prophets and to even our own Prophet of Islam as well. The same sources and the same types of mistakes, they existed. Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wasalam, just like the Prophet, their mission also was to preserve the integrity and the purity of the Islamic mission. So number one, it is important for us to understand what it is that the Jewish and the Christian communities were like and how Islam is distinct from those communities. That is the first point. Why is this discussion something that we should consider to be important for us? Not for some secondary reason, but in order for us to better understand our own religion and what distinguishes Ahlul Bayt and their school from other schools of thought within Islam. The second point I want to mention is that when we make this comparison, our point is not to put down or bring down another school of thought and to speak with pride about our own school of thought or about our own religion. There may be many faults and many defects within not our religion but within our practice of that religion and our communities, and we should not have that automatic response that, well, we are going to ignore any faults within our own community, and if somebody tells us that you did this, then we will immediately say, well, you guys did something worse. No. We should have that humility, and we will talk about the importance of humility in order to recognize our faults. Our purpose is not to bring ourselves up or to put somebody else down, but it is to better understand what our ideals are and what we are supposed to live up to without trying to put anybody else down. So that is the purpose that we are going to engage in. Now, with those 2 points in mind, let us continue the discussion after salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The first important point that I would like to remind us of is that there is a distinction and there is something comprehensive about Islam, which is not found in the same way in many other religions. And because I'm talking here specifically about the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, I want to distinguish Islam in one important way. If you look at the history of Judaism, then more important than differences in practice, jazakumullah, there are differences, more important than differences in belief, there are differences in practice that have caused the Jewish community to separate itself into different groups and different traditions. If you look at the Jewish community, it is sometimes described as a community that has practice, law, as the basis of the community. In fact, the law is considered the sacred teaching to which Jews who are religiously minded, they will devote their entire life. So if you look at Jewish scholars, they are scholars of Jewish law. They spend not just a few years getting a 3-year degree in law, but an entire lifetime studying and trying to understand the details of that law. And then it is that law which is the basis of their community, which is the basis of their identity. And differences in the practice of the law will be what separates one type of Jew from another. Whether it be the Reform and the Conservative and the Orthodox congregations and different groupings even within any one of these schools. Now, I don't want to say that there is no discussion of theology or belief. There are, of course, those details of belief which are important to the Jewish tradition, but the law is paramount. It is of the greatest importance. And this is something which is very different from what we find within the Christian community. In the Christian community, if you look, the law does not exist. It was abrogated not by Prophet Jesus himself, but by St. Paul, many years after the time of Prophet Jesus. There are certain rules which are followed by the Christians, but the basis of their identity is their creed and the belief. If you look at the councils which were organized by the church from the earliest days until later on, most important in those discussions and in those disagreements was to resolve questions of belief. In the early church, there were those who said that Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, is a human being who is a prophet and a messenger of Allah. These were the Christians who had preserved something of the original teachings of Prophet Isa alayhi salam as he himself taught them. There were others who had another belief in the divinity of Prophet Jesus, and they had other creeds. And this was what caused sometimes disagreement, sometimes violence, sometimes warfare, sometimes empires to separate from one another. That is what was the basis of the forming of their communities. So in Judaism, we find that practice and the law, what they do is the basis to a large extent of their identity. I don't want to say that is the only basis of their identity. And in Christianity we find that the basis of that identity has much more to do with belief than with practice. Again, practices are also important, within the Christian community. There are differences in certain celebrations. There are differences in the day of Easter, for example, and perhaps other holidays. But the basis of the identity of Christianity comes from creed. It comes from belief. That is the basis of what separates Protestants from Catholics, for example. And if there are differences in practice, then they are often secondary to those differences in belief. Now, we have now a simplified version of Christianity and Judaism. How is the landscape within Islam? Is it primarily belief which separates Muslims? Or is it primarily creed? Before we discuss and try to answer that question, let us think about it a little bit based on our own knowledge of Islam and our own practice of the religion. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad. And as I'm sure many of you may already have begun thinking, we can see elements of what I described from Judaism within Islam, and we can see elements of what I described from Christianity within Islam. Belief is very important. Of course, to those of us who are followers of Ahlul Bayt, we believe, and this is a hadith which we have from our Ma'asumeen, that wilayah is the foundation of our religion, and it is the most important part of our religion. And it has an effect on our beliefs and on our practices. Wilayah means a belief that there is one God. And because there is one God, there is to be one qibla and one direction and one movement by the community of those who are worshipful of God and faithful to His teachings. So that belief in Tawheed and in the wilayah that Allah has over us, it results in our believing in the wilayah of the Prophet and the wilayah of Ahlul Bayt. That belief in Tawheed has a direct effect on how we interact within our community. And so we find an element of Jewish emphasis on practice and law, and an element of the Christian emphasis on belief and creed within our Islamic communities. And that's not just about the Shia. It's not just about followers of Ahlul Bayt. Even within the broader Muslim community, it's common for people to think and to say that the Shia, they are followers of the fiqh of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. And the Sunni community is going to follow one of four schools of thought. All of you will have heard these names: the Hanbali, the Shafi'i, the Maliki, and the Hanafi schools of thought, or schools of law. But that is not the complete picture. This is in terms of practice. Hanafis will practice one way, and Shafi'is will practice their prayer, their fasting, their hajj, according to slightly different sets of rules and guidelines. That is about practice. Is it necessary that a Hanafi will have different beliefs from a Shafi'i? Historically, sometimes they have had different beliefs, but that is not what is essential to the identity of a Hanafi as a Hanafi or a Shafi'i as a Shafi'i. This describes their practice. But within the Sunni community, there were disagreements about creed that were just as sensitive and as deep as we find within the Christian community. About the justice of God. About the Quran. Is the Quran created or is the Quran eternal? There were differences about whether a person who commits a major sin, like murder for example, can be called a mu'min or a Muslim, or cannot be called a mu'min or a Muslim. And in some cases, these disagreements about belief, just like disagreements about practice, they cause people to form separate communities and even to create ill will and bloodshed with one another. So in the Muslim community, of course for us as Shia and followers of Ahlul Bayt, both creed, belief, and practice are important. And for the broader Muslim community as well, both belief and practice are important. And the true battlefield within Islam today actually is within the Sunni community, or those who call themselves Sunni, neither one will accept that the other person is Sunni. If you go to a Salafi and you ask them about somebody who says, I am Sunni, but they are Sufi, and they respect their saints and their peers and their murshids, and they may have an attachment to Ahlul Bayt. Both of them will say that we are Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. But if you ask the Salafi or the Wahhabi, are those people Sunni? They will say, no, they are not Sunni. Not because these are Hanbali and those are Hanafi or Shafi'i, but because of a matter of belief. And if you ask those who are followers of their traditions and their saints, and maybe their Sufi tariqas, do you consider the Salafis to be Sunnis? Then there is more than 150 or 200 years of history from Ottoman times in the Ottoman lands in Egypt, even from within Saudi Arabia, present-day Saudi Arabia itself, all the way to India, of prominent Sunni scholars joining hands with Shia scholars to write books refuting the bid'ah of the Wahhabis or the Salafis, and saying that we are Sunnis and we are the heirs of the tradition of Sunni Islam, and we do not consider these people to be Sunnis, and we do not consider them to be proper Muslims. In fact, the founder of the Wahhabi school of thought, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, both his father and his brother wrote books against his bid'ah and his teaching, saying that he calls all other Muslims to be kafir and he makes war upon them. Yes, through his fatwas, the Shia were attacked, but also many Sunnis were attacked and killed. His own family were among the first people who said, we are Ahlul Sunnah and we do not consider this to be Sunni teaching. So the true battlefield within Islam is within those who say we are Sunni, but they are not. My point is that it is not because one Sunni, the Hanafis for example, prays with their hands folded and the Malikis pray with their hands down. Or because they pray Asr at one time and the others pray Asr at a slightly earlier or a slightly later time. It isn't practice that is causing this dispute. It is a matter of creed and a matter of belief, which has an effect in creed as well. So in Islam, both belief and practice are important. Now, having said this, it might seem like this is a unique tragedy that has befallen the Muslim community. If the Jews were going to be divided based on questions of law, at the very least, those questions of theology and creed were not so front and central and were not going to be so divisive. If the Christian community was going to be divided by belief and by creed, then at least the questions of practice were not so front and central. And that is the truth. Within Christian history, they were able to change and to adapt to many different cultures without really dividing their community. At one time, the language of many Christians was Aramaic. That was the language which Prophet Jesus himself spoke. But then, many of them began to speak and write in Greek. Some of the Gospels that survived were composed in Greek. They were not composed by Isa a.s. himself or by his immediate companions. They were composed by people who spoke Greek. That became the language of the Christian church. And in other churches, they adopted Coptic as their main language, or Latin became the language of the Catholic Church. And this did not cause bloodshed or warfare. It wasn't so important. Aramaic did not remain as central to Christian practice as Hebrew always was and still is for the Jews, as Arabic always was and still is for the Muslims as a unifying force, because the practice was not that important. They adopted Christmas in December, which even they admit was not the time when Isa a.s. was born. They adopted the practice of Easter, the practice and the celebration of many different holidays, the Christmas trees and other things, which even they admit were not originally Christian practices and were not taken from the religion of the prophets of Bani Israel. But they adapted them and they adopted them, and it didn't cause that division, because practice was not front and center within the Christian religion. But within Islam, we have divisions on the basis of belief, and we have divisions within our practice as well. So is that a blessing or is it a curse? Now, it might seem to us that this is something which is going to be a source of division, and it has been within Islamic history. But I want to make one very important point. And this is that we have to be realistic. We have to be able to understand our own weaknesses and our own faults and deficiencies and our shortcomings. We have to be able to readjust our actions on the basis of changed circumstances and needs. Those who sugarcoat their own history, those who always find fault with others and say everything that is wrong within the Muslim community is a foreign conspiracy, those are not people who are ever going to do anything constructive for the Muslim community. But having said that, let us also not be cynical and pessimistic. If there is a person who is negative about the Muslim Ummah, if there is a person who says that I have given up on the Muslims, I can't be bothered to try to work to improve the community. Our Islamic centers, they're filled with politics. I'm not going to participate and I'm not going to contribute. Our Islamic countries and our Islamic societies, they are hopeless. They are basket cases. Then you will not find that person practicing according to the Sunnah and the Seerah of the Prophet or Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam condemned the Kufans for their failings and for their shortcomings. But he didn't do so in order to abandon them. He didn't do so in order to say that I have nothing to do with you. Imam Hasan alayhi salam also maintained his correspondence, and he had Shia in Kufa. Those 10 years that Imam Hasan maintained the truce with Muawiyah, those were not years when Imam Hasan didn't have any religious teaching or any links or any connection with his followers, many of whom, if not most of whom, were in Kufa. Those were the Shia of Ahlul Bayt, whom Imam Hasan passed on when he passed the imamah on to Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. And Imam Hussein answered the call of the Kufans. Every politician in the time of Imam Hussein said, don't go to Kufa. Go to Yemen. Go somewhere else. According to some narrations, go as far as India, go to the frontier, go to Khurasan, go somewhere, but don't go to Kufa. Because we have tried and we have tested the Kufans. But Imam Hussein rejected that advice. It was sound political advice. If you were to take a political consultant and hire that person to give you good advice, in the time of Imam Hussein, this is the advice that they would give you. But that is material advice. That is political advice. The Imam didn't abandon the Kufans because he was willing to sacrifice in order to raise their conscience. And it was those sacrifices and the blood that was given by Imam Hussein, which is the reason why in the generation of Imam Muhammad Baqir and Imam Ja'far Sadiq you find hundreds. According to Hasan ibn Ali al-Washa in the time of Imam Rida alayhi salam, he says that 900 sheikhs in the masjid of Kufa were present, and I heard them, and each and every one of them would say, Qala Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq. And I was there to listen to their ahadith and write their ahadith. 900 people publicly saying that we are students of Imam Ja'far Sadiq. That was not found in any city for any other person who claimed to be an Islamic scholar. And it was because the Imams knew all of those faults and deficiencies within their community. But unlike many of us, they didn't take the politician's path. They didn't take the prudent path. They gave their blood and they gave their sweat and they gave their lives in order to raise their community, even if it be one notch. So we shouldn't be cynics and we shouldn't be pessimists. And let us also be honest. If we are going to recognize our faults, then we also should take pride in those things that are unique about our faith. Once again, I don't want to say this is a matter of putting down any other faith. But let us look at the 1400-year history, not just of Ahlul Bayt, but of followers of Ahlul Bayt. Let us know for our young ones and for our old ones, what is the heritage that we are proud of? I want to just give a few examples. But in all of those areas where Islam spread and people were reluctant to accept Islam, because they thought that it was a dry religion, or they thought it was a primitive religion, or they thought that it was the religion of some desert tribes that was not worthy of a great civilization, then who was it who was able to spread Islam and convince those people to enter into this religion? It was either the Imams themselves, or the descendants of the Imams, or the students of the Imams. Take a look from Morocco, where it was the Idrisids, the descendants of Imam Hasan, who conveyed a message of love for Ahlul Bayt, who were able to bring the Berber tribes to Islam. And go all the way to Indonesia today, where Islam spread after the glory days of Islam had come to an end. In the days of European expansion, that is when Islam spread to Indonesia and to Malaysia. And many of them were Shia traders who had gone from Yemen, and many of whom were Sadat, who spread a message of love for Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. At that time, Islam didn't have the most powerful armies. Islam did not have the greatest prestige and political power, but it had the spiritual strength to convert entire societies to this religion. So that is a matter of pride for followers of Ahlul Bayt, that when Islam was not able to be understood by people, it was followers of Ahlul Bayt, and it was the message of Ahlul Bayt, and it was the love of Ahlul Bayt, and the pristine teachings of Ahlul Bayt, in whatever form they reached people, that allowed people to accept Islam. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the spread of Islam in Central Asia, in Persia, in South Asia, in India, then you will be able to even think of specific examples of what I am speaking of. If there was one Islamic society that was able to not only overthrow imperialism, but maintain its independence. You have seen the Arab Spring, you have seen attempts before, and you have seen attempts since. But if there is one society that was able to overthrow foreign domination and colonialism and neo-colonialism and maintain its independence within the Muslim community, then it is not one of the 54 countries which are not followers of Ahlul Bayt. It is those who are followers of Ahlul Bayt who were able to do so and maintain their dignity in spite of the opposition of the entire world. If the followers of Ahlul Bayt are a minority of Muslims, then why were they the only ones who were able to successfully implement and make an Islamic experiment that no other school of thought within Islam was able to do? If there is one group that was able to militarily defeat those who had occupied Palestine, they were not the only ones to make an attempt. Sometimes you might say that, well, of course the Shia did it, but if other groups had a chance, they also would have been able to do something similar. In the early days of Islam, those who were outside of Ahlul Bayt, they didn't have a chance. The Prophet always gave other companions a chance, go first. He didn't send Imam Ali ﷺ first. Not in the battle of Khandaq, not in other battles. He said others, you can volunteer, you can go forth. But once they had proved that they were not able to do so, then the Prophet allowed Imam Ali ﷺ to go forth and show what the courage of a warrior from Ahlul Bayt is able to accomplish. And we see that history repeated in our own time. There were at least 4 battles that were fought by the united efforts of the societies of those countries that were not deriving their inspiration from the martyrdom and from the sacrifice of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. And then there is a group that derives their strength from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. They were able to defeat that powerful enemy that the combined efforts of other Muslims were not able to defeat. Now, my point is not to say that any of these instances is perfect, that there are no mistakes, there are no shortcomings, there are no problems within these experiences. My point is to say that if we recognize those shortcomings, then we should also recognize these successes, which are peerless not just among the Muslim community, but even if you look at other communities, other religious groups, other national groups. then you will be hard-pressed to find examples like this. And there are not just examples of victories, but even maintaining dignity in the face of oppression and defeat. Perhaps the most beautiful example that I can think of is the example of the oppressed mu'mineen of Bahrain. Truly, for all of us, that is also a matter of pride that is no less than the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran or the victory of the resistance against the occupiers of Palestine. Imagine 500 years of continuous oppression by Portuguese imperialism, by British imperialism, and then by a minority extremist government that attributes itself to an extremist school of thought within Islam. They call themselves Muslim, but they impress the majority of the native inhabitants of that land. What is the natural result that comes from that type of continuous oppression, one generation after another? If you look at Europe, you will see that the discrimination that the Jewish community in Europe was faced with, it wasn't as severe as what the followers of Ahlul Bayt suffered in the territory of the Wahhabis. If you compare, then it wasn't as severe. But even if we take it for granted that it was equal or it was greater, the natural result is that people began to abandon their religion. The Zionist movement was an atheist movement. Look at the history, and you will find that the most prominent Zionists were enemies of religious Jews. And religious Torah Jews were the worst enemies of Zionism from its foundation. They said it is a godless and it is an atheist philosophy that is based on communism, that is based on European nationalism, and has nothing to do with Judaism. This changed later on. But in the early days of Zionism in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, it was primarily secular and anti-religious Jews who were Zionists. So one result of that extreme oppression is that people said that our religion and our values cannot inspire us and cannot guide us. And then the very clear result of that oppression, we see it not just in Palestine, but in many other places. When people have been oppressed beyond a limit, then they also become victims, and when they have the chance, they turn towards extremism and they oppress those whom they are able to now overpower. The victims will often commit worse crimes than their oppressors when they have the chance, against their oppressors or against anybody else that they're able to get their hands on. That's nature of human history, and we can find countless examples of that. But the beauty of the struggle of the believers and the followers of Ahlul Bayt in Bahrain and in many other places, and an example that we have in any other place that the Shia are being oppressed, is that there is oppression, there is violence, there is aggression, there is suppression, and an attempt to blot out our identity and our practices. But the Shia have not forgotten their identity. They have not turned to godlessness and to atheism and to secularism to save them. And they have not allowed themselves to commit similar crimes on others as were committed upon themselves. Find examples of that in human history and you will be hard-pressed. There might be one Nelson Mandela who says that we will not victimize our former oppressors. But it is as if you are keeping a lid on something that is boiling over in society. It is a pride of the Shia, and it is a pride of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, that we may be provoked. But our leadership has never given a fatwa or a statement that allows the shedding of innocent blood. Our communities, aside from individuals who act based on their individual initiative, have not allowed the targeting of innocents. And we see that very beautifully illustrated in many different places, perhaps most eloquently within Bahrain. This strength that I am describing, again, not to say that there are only good things and there is no negativity, but this strength It comes because we have both belief and we have practice that is a force for our cohesion, and that unites us and brings us together as a community. So if you look at Islam and you say that, well, we have both beliefs and we have both practices, so we're going to be worse off than the Jews and the Christians who only have one of those two, then this is the answer. It is that creed, it is that strong belief and that iman, and it is those practices that are the source of your strength. And I'm not just speaking theoretically. There are practical examples of that strength which society and even non-Muslims will recognize. And if they don't recognize it, we should recognize it. Where there are shortcomings, we should overcome. And we should correct those shortcomings. But those shortcomings should not blind us to these sources of strength. These examples that I have mentioned, they are sources of pride that we can take throughout all of human history. And I encourage you to look and to see how many of the non-Muslims have derived inspiration from our strength and our resistance. This is a majlis of Hussein, so I can't give all of the examples, but because there is one controversy which is going on right now, I want to mention it, even though it is not directly related to our Islamic practice and belief, but it is something which is just one illustration of the principle that I am speaking of. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. And I'm mentioning this example because of a broader principle. That when I say that these are points of pride, somebody might say, well, of course, you are a follower of Ahlul Bayt. You are a Shia, you're going to say that the Shia have wonderful examples. That's natural. So I want to bring this example. There is a very famous Arab singer, actually, and a poet, whose name is Feiruz. She's an elderly lady, maybe close to 80 years of age, and her songs and her poetry, they are very well known in many different parts of the Arab world. She's not a Muslim. She is an Arab Christian from an Orthodox background, from a Beiruti family, before Beirut was part of Lebanon and before Lebanon was a country, but she is Syrian or Lebanese, depending on what country you look at the time of her birth. There was no Lebanon at that time. So a non-Muslim, but a member of the mosaic of communities living within the Middle East, who is very prominent in terms of Arabic art and literature, and very well known in society. Now, naturally, because this is somebody who is prominent, because this is somebody who is well known, many different groups want to claim the identity of these prominent people. You might have been familiar within Islam, sometimes a rumor circulates that a famous basketball player has become Muslim. And all of a sudden everybody is sending messages, did you hear that so-and-so has become Muslim? Well, who cares if they've become Muslim or if they haven't become Muslim? Islam is not strengthened because a celebrity becomes Muslim. Islam is not weakened because a celebrity rejects Islam. It's not a matter of pride. But yes, if there is a celebrity in any field, sports or literature or art or politics, who says something worth considering, then we should look at it because of the value of the statement. Not because our faith depends on the affirmation of a celebrity or one person or another person. So now this is my point that I wanted to make. This is a symbol of the Christian Arab community. Her son, Ziyad al-Rahbani, he was speaking and giving an interview a few days ago, and he said that my mother has a great love and a great admiration for the Shia resistance of Lebanon, and a great admiration specifically for Sayyid Hasan Nasrullah, the leader of the resistance. Now, all of a sudden, this was a major controversy in the Arab world. It's actually found in some English language articles as well, because it's such a major issue in the Arab world, given the divisions. But if you follow the media, you may have read about it or you may have heard about it. You may wonder, why is it such a big deal if a prominent Christian lady and her son, he is also well known as a poet and as a scholar himself, Ziyad al-Rahbani, Why is it such a big deal if they praise the resistance in such a way? But they are speaking because they are members of that community. And this is the truth. If you look at Christians and other minorities in Lebanon or in Syria or in many other places, they truly believe that their rights will only be protected if the school of thought of the followers of Ahlul Bayt spreads, and the school of thought of the enemies of Ahlul Bayt is eliminated. This admiration is not just some celebrity saying something about a Shia figure, and so I say, let me tell you about this. It is because it reflects the recognition, in truth, of a large number of people who are living on the ground. These are not people who have been paid to say something. These are not people who are saying something that is politically correct, and then they are going to get international prizes and they are going to get rewarded. These are people like the poets in the time of Bani Umayyah and Bani al-Abbas, who had the opportunity to earn millions if they would praise the caliphs of their time, if they would praise the kings of their time. But because they were people of conscience, they would compose their poetry in praise of Ahlul Bayt. And sometimes they would willingly suffer loss of property and even loss of life and banishment because of those words of poetry that they would compose. So these are people who are living on the ground. They are members of different religious communities, Christians and other groups, and they can see with their own experiences how it is that the followers of Ahlul Bayt and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, they are preserving their lives and their dignity, and the lives and the dignity of many different Muslims of all schools of thought, Sunni and Shia. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. So when I gave these examples, I'm not giving these examples as a theoretical example. I'm not giving these examples because of my Muslim bias or because of my Shia bias. But I want to make a very important point for each and every one of us, to take pride in our identity, to recognize the strength of our identity, and the intrinsic value of the teachings and the lives of those religious leaders whom we honor and whom we shed tears for and whom we commemorate. If we don't recognize it, then many other people of conscience throughout the world, they will recognize it. And it would be a tragedy if we ourselves do not appreciate the strength of our heritage and non-Muslims were to appreciate the strength of our heritage and the value of our heritage more than we ourselves. This comes from those attributes that we find within Ahlul Bayt ﷺ and within their followers. When we see that there are these differences that have come within the Ummah, then the courage, the spirit of ithar and self-sacrifice, forbearance, steadfastness that we find within Ahlul Bayt, these are the attributes that are the source of our strength. In the face of differences in belief and in the face of differences of practice, these attributes are what are going to bring us together and allow us to be able to be constructive members of our societies. Inshallah, we will continue this discussion in our final session tomorrow and discuss this in greater depth. But this is a lesson which we can learn from history. It is a lesson which we can take pride in, yes, but it also means that we have a very heavy burden on our shoulders. The message of Karbala did not reach us. And the values and the history of Karbala did not reach us through a very easy path. Sacrifices were given from the very first day. Pure blood was shed from the very first day. Many tears, many sacrifices, many lives, many years of imprisonment. Many families were torn apart and people were sent into banishment, thousands of miles from their homes, because they said, Ya Hussein. And they carried on that message. That is how it reached us. And so we have to honor it and we have to value it. मैं उन लोगों की बात नहीं कर रहा जो मुहिब्बान अहले बैत हैं, اور جو ہر صدی میں ہر زمانے میں قربانیاں دیتے تھے اہل بیت کے ذکر کو زندہ رکھنے کے لیے، بلکہ خود اہل بیت علیہم السلام کربلا کے بعد اسیر ہوئے اور اسیر ہو کے کربلا سے کوفہ گئے اور کوفے سے پھر شام گئے، اور سب سے سخت مصیبت خود اہل بیت کی زبانی شام میں ان پہ پیش آئی۔ امام سجاد سے پوچھا گیا کہ اے فرزند رسول، یہ جتنی مصیبتیں کربلا سے لے کے مدینے تک آپ پر پڑی، تو ان سب میں سب سے زیادہ سخت اور سب سے زیادہ شدید مصیبت کون سی تھی؟ تو امام نے عاشورہ کا تذکرہ نہیں کیا، کربلا کا تذکرہ نہیں کیا، کوفے کا تذکرہ نہیں کیا، بلکہ امام نے 3 بار کہا الشام الشام الشام۔ وہ یزید کا دربار تھا کہ جب میں نے دیکھا کہ کس طرح سے آل رسول کے ساتھ گستاخی کی جا رہی ہے، کچھ واقعات میں شام کے دربار کے آپ کے سامنے میں پیش کرنا چاہتا ہوں۔ فاطمہ بنت حسین روایت کرتی ہیں کہ جب یزید کے دربار میں ہم پیش کیے گئے تو ایک گستاخ شامی نے یزید سے خطاب کر کے میری طرف اشارہ کر کے کہا کہ اے یزید، اس لڑکی کو مجھے دے دو۔ تو میں پریشان ہوئی، میں نے کہا کہ جب انہوں نے شریعت سے سرپیچی کر لی تو ہو سکتا ہے اپنی شریعت میں اس کام کو بھی وہ جائز سمجھیں۔ میں فوراً اپنی پھوپھی کے پاس جا کر میں نے گھبرا کے کہا کہ پھوپھی اماں، کیا یتیمی کے بعد کنیزی بھی میرے نصیب ہوگی؟ تو جناب زینب نے اس وقت جواب دیا کہ اس فاسق کو کوئی حق نہیں پہنچتا کہ وہ آپ کے ساتھ کسی قسم کی جسارت کرے۔ اس شامی نے جب یہ جواب سنا تو ذہن میں یہ بات آئی کہ یہ کس قسم کے اسیر ہیں جن کے ہاتھ بندھے ہوئے ہیں، پیر بندھے ہوئے ہیں، لیکن اس شجاعت کے ساتھ یزید کو جواب دیتے ہیں۔ یزید نے اس شامی نے پوچھا کہ اے یزید، یہ کون اسیر ہیں؟ تو یزید نے کہا یہ فاطمہ بنت حسین ہیں اور یہ زینب بنت علی ہیں۔ تو شامی نے کہا کہ کیا فاطمہ بنت حسین جو جناب سیدہ کے بے فرزند ہیں، کیا زینب بنت علی جو رسول کی نواسی ہے؟ یزید میں سمجھا کہ یہ شام کے، یہ روم کے یا یہ فارس کے کہیں کے اسیر ہوں گے، یہ تو نے کیا کر دیا؟ اور مجھے نہیں پتا کہ کیا میری یہ گستاخی معاف ہو سکتی ہے۔ اس قسم کے مظالم یزید کے دربار میں آل رسول کے ساتھ پیش ہوئے۔ یزید نے فوراً اپنے خطیب کو حکم دیا کہ خطبہ کہے تاکہ شاید لوگوں کی توجہ بڑھ جائے۔ اس خطبے کو امام زین العابدین علیہ السلام نے کاٹا، ایک جملہ کہا۔ امام نے کہا کہ تم نے اپنے دین کو دنیا کی خاطر بیچ دیا، اور جس ممبر پہ اب تم کھڑے ہو کے بیٹھ کے خطبہ دے رہے ہو، یہ میرے ہی جد کی تلوار نے اس ممبر کو قائم کیا۔ اب آپ انہی کی ساتھ گستاخی کر رہے ہیں کہ جن کی وجہ سے یہ ممبر موجود ہے اور یہ دین باقی ہے۔ یزید نے اس وقت امام زین العابدین سے کہا کہ میں آپ کی 3 حاجتوں کو پورا کروں گا، اب محفل کو برخاست کر دیا جائے۔ آل رسول کو ایک ایسے قید خانے میں رکھا گیا کہ جس میں 4 راتوں میں رہنا 4 سال کی قیدی کے برابر ہو۔ امام زین العابدین سے روایت ملتی ہے کہ وہاں پہ امام کی کم سن بچی سکینہ بنت الحسین خواب کے عالم میں ایک خواب دیکھتی ہیں، اور وہ خواب بعد میں اہل بیت کے لیے بیان کیا۔ سکینہ بنت حسین فرماتی ہیں کہ میری آنکھ لگی، خواب کے عالم میں نے ایک معظمہ کو دیکھا جو اپنے ہاتھ کو سر پہ رکھے ہوئے اندھیرے میں آگے بڑھ رہی ہیں۔ میں نے اپنی پھوپھی سے خواب میں دریافت کیا کہ یہ کون ہیں؟ تو میری پھوپھی نے کہا کہ یہ آپ کی دادی فاطمہ بنت محمد ہیں۔ فوراً سکینہ نے کہا کہ میں نے خواب کے عالم میں آگے بڑھ کے کہا کہ دادی اماں، کیا آپ کو معلوم ہے کہ آپ کی جد کی آپ کے والد کی امت نے ہمارے ساتھ کیا کیا؟ آپ کو کیا معلوم ہے کہ میرے بھائی کو پیاسا قتل کر دیا گیا، میرے سامنے میرے قاسم کے بدن کو پامال کر دیا گیا، میرے اکبر کے لاش کو کو ٹکڑے ٹکڑے کر دیا گیا. کیا اے دادی اماں آپ کو معلوم ہے کہ میرے بابا حسین میرے سامنے پیاسے شہید ہوئے؟ یہ سننا تھا کہ جناب سیدہ نے کہا بیٹا بس، آپ نے میرے جگر کے ٹکڑے ٹکڑے کر دیے. یہ دیکھو میرے ہاتھوں میں میرے حسین کی خون بھری قمیص ہے جو میں اپنے پاس لیے رہی ہوں، اور روز محشر میں خدا کی بارگاہ میں پیش کروں گی. انا للہ و انا الیہ راجعون. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.